Hello, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. How about you?
Good, thanks. Yeah, I just sent you an email. Sorry, I had put it in a draft and I forgot to click send. So, um,
It's okay.
I gave you some feedback on your project. Let me know if you have questions.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get started with the final review. Today we're gonna go over Unit 2 through 13. Your final exam will be multiple choice. And there's some portion with the code, but usually I give you the code and I would ask certain things like, what does it mean? And then you would pick the options. Okay, so final exam passcode, I will release that in the announcement and also in the module for the page where you install your lockdown browser. Okay, all right. Maybe sometime you have to authenticate again to Zoom and it shows like that. That's okay. Okay, so you can download your final review from here, and then we'll go through it. There's like 60 questions, so it should be pretty quick. And I hope you had good Thanksgiving week. All right, so now we'll start with number 1. The first question asks you to fill in the blank. The blank is a technique to pinpoint most resource extensive spot in the application. So at the beginning, we learned how to do profiling, and then we got into how to use some of the tools for profiling in Python. So the answer for number 1 is profiling. And you will find some questions like this, where you don't have to type in the answer, but you will have to click on the option, very similar to the quiz. Okay, so for 1 is profiling. For number 2, it asks you what type of program is used to run an application and monitor how long each function takes. And you can use the type of program is the profiler. We know how to implement timeit in our program, where you can also use time module if you don't use Linux. So there are several ways that you will need to do that for your project, where you need to really benchmark your program. So after you have created or designed your program, somewhere in your project, you need to add in a component where you show me that you test your program and look at the benchmark option, okay? All right, for number 3, the type of Python profilers uses C extension, and it is suitable for profiling long-running programs. So for the extensive program, we can use C profile, and this is going to use the C extension. So keep in mind that it is working with C. So that means that when you test these programs using C profile, you got to make sure that your system has the C package. So if you use Visual Studio, you already have the C++. But if you don't use Visual Studio, right, you got to make sure that your system has GCC. So that means that if you're running Linux, you got to make sure that your package is installed, and we can adapt C profile. So for number 3, C profile is the answer. Okay, give me 1 second. Let me see why it's not. I had clear out my highlighter, so give me 1 second. You go back and make sure that it's there. Okay. All right, let's go back to share screen now. Okay, for number 4, when designing an application, which of the following option is not an approach in optimizing the code? So we know that we need to make it run, of course, making sure that we don't have any kind of errors that cause our program to stop. Make sure that we have accuracy in our program, so make it right. And then the majority of this course address performance, so we need to make it fast. Sometimes improve the speed, not necessarily the fastest, but to make sure that it is efficient and speedy. And the option that is not is going to be make it parallel. You don't have to write a parallel program, but if you want to implement parallelism, you can. In Python, you do have many options in how you can improve your program. And of course, traditionally, we can write a synchronous program where it's just top down, really simple. So it doesn't have to be parallel, right? You can, but it is not required. So D is the option for number 4. For number 5, let me zoom out a little bit so you can see the prior answer as well. For number 5, what type of profiling tools consist of graphical user interface that is useful to analyze the profiling output from C profile using Linux KDE? And in Linux, you can use the KDE package, which is really implemented for the KDE desktop. So you can use GNU or GNU, right? Or you can use KDE. By default, most of the Debian Linux OS uses GNU, but you can install KDE, which allows you to adapt Kcache grind. Now, you don't have to install the KDE desktop, but you can install the package that is adapted for KDE. So in the past, what I did was I implemented the KDE desktop prior to your class, and it took a lot of space in the virtual machine. So in this semester, I didn't use the KDE desktop, but used the package for KDE, and it worked. So you can use GNU desktop with the KDE package, and you can implement Kcache grind. The reason why you need this is because when they wrote the program for the graphical user interface, they used the library from KDE, which allows you to control the input-output, like the buttons and all of these things in the graphs. So Kcache grind is able to display on your user interface, on your UI. And it needs the KDE library. So that's why you need that package. Okay, so for the answer for number 5 is Kcache grind. For number 6, to use line profiler module with the functions that need optimizing in Python code, what is used to monitor the function of the program? And we learn how to decorate our function throughout this class. At the beginning, we learn how to use @profile, okay? And you would use this decorator to optimize your code by monitoring your function. Ultimately, what that does is we can track our function call. So as you know that a lot of the things we use, it's still C in the back. So as the Python interpreter sees the decorator, it's going to be able to track the functionality of your function call, right, in your program. So that's how you use the decorator. You would use @profile. And that was part of like the whole profiling concept that we addressed since the beginning. For 7, in Python, which module is used to inspect bytecode instructions in an application? And you can use DIS module. This is something that you can integrate to really look at your bytecode instructions. So ultimately, when you write or implement functions from the library, right, things would be broken down into low level as instructions. So at the machine language level, it still needs to be able to convert that to instructions so your processor can take that information and convert it to executable actions, right, in the program. So the DIS module would be useful for that, to inspect bytecode, and that's your keyword there. Any questions so far? Okay, a lot of these questions you probably have seen throughout your assignment in your notes. Well, question 8. Let's see if I can. True or false? Optimized time is used to describe the amount of time to run an algorithm, and that's false. We talked about big O notation, time and space when we discussed time complexity. And time complexity is used to describe the amount of time to run an algorithm. And so when you're looking at your algorithm, when you design your project, you got to think about like the loops or any kind of sequential implementation and iteration, or if you have recursive functions, in how you implement the procedure to really solve a problem in your software. And so we would indicate that as the amount of time to be able to run the entire algorithm. And when you address the time, we want to look at the worst case scenario, assuming that the system is not optimized to the max speed. There might be slow processor, lack of memory. And so if you're looking at the best case scenario, right, that will be only for the best system that's running the application in an ideal stage. When we look at the worst case scenario in time complexity, and we want to look at space versus time, then we want to measure the amount of time in the worst case where the system would be slow, there's delay. It could be also web-based. We can think about like how connection could be slow between the server and the client request. So you want to really analyze your program in the worst case scenario. And so when we touch on that, we talked about how we can measure time. Okay, then for number 9, given the below Python program, determine the time complexity of the program. So you have a list that contain integers, and this list is labeled as numbers. You have a variable called total, initialized at 0. You have one for loop, and we want to look at the index in the numbers, so it's going to iterate through each of the element. And we want to compute the total, so we have a running sum. So as it loops through, it's going to add the values in the container, and we want to output that, right? So we want to look at each sum as it loops through, and then we want to print out the entire sum once it gets to the end. So when you have one for loop that's integrated in the algorithm, your big O notation is dependent on your input, which is the number of elements in your container. So your O of n is where n is your number of input. That means that we look at the number of elements in our list. And so in this case, if you count them up, that will be 9. So in a larger list, let's say that if you have a list of 1,000 values, right? Your O of n, the n is going to be your input, which is 1,000. And so when it loops through, right, as it reaches the end, you want to look at how the performance would be depending on the number of elements. So the more elements, of course, it's going to take a little bit longer time. But in a multi-core environment, sometime that we can write our program to be able to have a thread pool that will handle, right, your container elements a little better. So in the sequential program like this, it is truly dependent on the number of output, which is your n. And here in this case, there's only 9 elements. Okay. Now, when you have an inner for loop, when you nest it, right, then you would look at n squared. And so as it loops on the inside and then the outside, so you would raise the power. And so your O of n will be the n squared. Okay. All right. For number 10, here is the program. We've got a little snapshot there. Given the below program, which uses bisect module, describe the purpose of line 6. And we have POS is bisect dot bisect, and we would pass test score 96. So when you look at the program, we have the import statement, that's the module bisect. And we have a list containing test scores. You have various test scores, not necessarily in order. And then first, then we want to use the sorted method to reorganize our container in ascending order. So in that case, now test score is gonna contain the ascending order list, so it's sorted. And we're gonna print it. Then we would have our POS, which is gonna be our object. And here it's gonna use bisect, and we're gonna pass test score 96. So it's asking you what this line means, line 6, before we print it. So that means that we are gonna take the value that's passed in the parameter here, which is 96, and we're gonna insert it into the sorted list, which is line 3. Then we're gonna return the position of the inserted element. So when you use this and you print out POS, it's gonna not return the value, but it's gonna return where it inserted 96 in the list, which is your index value. Okay. So if we want confirmation that we had added this value into our container, you can do it this way using the bisect module. Okay. So if you are not familiar with that, you can run the program, you can go back to the chapter and you can take a look. All right, pretty easy. Any question? Okay, so for number 11, we are going to also look at the Python program. It's a short program. We want to explain the procedure and the output of the program. So here you're using collections module and you are going to use deck. And when we do that, we really want to use deck to establish a container. So here we would have a container called DQ, and it is a deck. And we simply have a string stored in that container. And in order to add more characters to the string, which is ABC, line 5 is when we extend that container, right? So we add additional characters to it. Then what we're going to do is we are going to do a rotation. So we use the rotate method and we pass the -1. So that means that we are applying this method to the DQ, which is our container, and we're going to print it. So here are the procedure. We import deck from the collections module. We create a deck object called DQ, which contains ABC. We add the items or the characters DE, H, I, J to the deck. Now, when you see the -1, it's going to go left. So you're going to rotate left, right? So rotate the leftmost element to the right. So that means the A is going to get rotated to the back. So it's going to become the last element where it was the first element originally. So when you pass the -1 here, it's going to take the first element, which is element 0, and it's going to push it to the end of the container. And in Python, you can use these values to control. And if you're familiar with 30A, when I spent a lot of time doing inverted index, where you can actually access, right, elements using like negative value, which is right to left, compared to positive value, that's going to be left to right. So when you see the -1 here, you just think about left. So it's going to rotate the leftmost element to the right. So it's going to push it to the back. Okay, when you use the rotate. And so ultimately, when we print this out, right, as A is going to be in the back, B is going to become the first element, and A is going to become the last element. So it's going to print out, right, your deck, which is, it encompasses a list that we started with when we add A, B, C, and the other characters, but we moved the A. So the A is going to be in the back. Any question? Okay, so make sure we know how to read like each of the line here and knows what it means. Okay, for 12, fill in the blank. The blank is a data structure that associates a set of key value pairs. It is used to assign a specific index to each key so that it has associated value and can be stored into an array. And this is called the hash map. So when we started going over the array chapter, right, how to use array as a container in Python, as some of you are familiar with that from C++ and Java. But in Python, we started with lists and then we expanded into array. So hash map, and the key word for this question is where you look at this part right here, where it mentions specific index to each key. So it has an association with the key. And so the value would then be stored in an array. So it's assigning an index for each of the key. And that will be mapping to the hash key, which is hash map. Okay, so it is also a data structure, and it uses the key value pairs. All right. For 13, given the below program, describe the program procedure and output. So in this one, we are going to use the default dict from collections. And we would start with our container, which is a list, which encompasses tuples, right? So when you see the parentheses, that's going to be your tuple. But in the default dict, right, you're able to implement your data structure a little differently. Okay, so what we have to do is, if we have a container that contains associate values, right? So we would have red is 20, green is 15, white is 40, and so on. And this, you can use it for like e-commerce, where you would have inventory, let's say for t-shirts or pants or hats, whatnot. And so we would then next, we would then create an object, and you can call it anything you want. In this case, line 4 is the object is D. And D is going to be a default dict, which is, right, we pass the list type here, where it is going to contain this list. And as it has multiple values, because you want to treat this as multi-dimension, because it is a tuple nested in a list, right? And you would have multiple values here for each of the tuple. So you would then need to use 2 variables when you loop this. So you would have for I and J in hats, because this is your hats. We want to be able to access the index of, that means the element of your default dict, and we would append the J. Okay, then we would sort out before we print. So after it's sorted, and then it's going to print. So here is the procedure, right? We imported the default dict from collection. We defined the hats list where it contains values and associated key. We define our object D to store the default factory using default dict class. So when you create the D here, that becomes a default factory. And in order to access it, and so what we want to do is we would use a for loop to be able to access the elements as it is nested to display the sorted content of your default factory. And so this is how you would use default dict to create a default factory. Right? And this concept is really built on the dictionary using nested tuple inside a list, which is your default factory content. So once we use this, and we would append J, which is going to be your value, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to sort it, and then we're going to display the sorted, right, key and value. So black, because it starts with a B, it's going to go first. And so if you look at black, it's actually back here at the beginning. So once we sort it, it's going to be listed first, and it would have 60. So when it outputs, what you're going to have is you're going to have a list nested in a tuple. And as we append it, it's going to also nest another list within. So in this case, we're building a structure with multiple level of nested container as a default factory. So you have black, and then blue, and then brown, and then green, and red, and white. And it just uses the first character in that string to really sort it. Okay, so when you do that with the sorted here, it allows you to be organizing your container in an ascending order. Okay, so this is how you would write a default factory using default dict. Okay, then for number 14, given the below program, we want to describe the program procedures and output. So we would have your foods, line 1, that's your container, and it is a list. So we would have different string to represent our foods. And we would have a variable called seek. And in the list itself, we would be able to nest in our for loop along with the if. So in Python, you can do it in one line like this, where you don't have to, put it into separate section. So that's kind of nice. And then we would want to print out, right? So basically, we're going to do a search for that. So here's the procedure. First, you define your list as foods. You define your object seek to search for the string called large right here. Okay. So if I'm looking for a large item, right, there's 3 of them, but you can have a very large container and you can do it this way to search. Right. And so instead of doing it statically like this, you can also have the user input what seek is, right? And then redefine it and make it like a certain input here. So you would be able to allow the user to type in, let's say if I'm looking for a medium instead of a large or a small. And so it would just be able to pass that string. So that would take maybe another line. So after we have implemented the search string large, we would define your index. And in this case, we want to make it into a dictionary. Okay, because if you look at it, we need to make it in a container where it's feasible to be able to further implement how we would associate keys and value. So then we would use our for loop to enumerate through our original list. And we want to be able to split the string, right? Large pizza, medium lasagna, and so on. So we want to split the string. So after this here, we would enumerate here and we would use the split method. And then after that, we would nest the if statement. So if word is not in the index, right, it's going to be able to seek for the index. So index, and we want a password here. So what we want to do is we want to really treat the string as its individual entity, and then also look into the string itself as we split it. Then we want to define the results and store the index in the items contained in the search key, because it still has to look through your string and look for specific large, right? Large pizza, large spaghetti, large steak. So in order to do that, we want to store the index item and find the actual search key. And here we would use the inverted index to search for large. So in the last part, we want to find the index large. That's how we'll be able to search. And we would store that into the result. But in order to print it out, you have to look through it again, right, to really show that. So here, the inverted index search for large and then store in the result word. Then we're going to display the result containing the index element that contain large. Okay, you don't have to be thorough like what I did. I just wrote down the meaning for each of the lines so that way I know how my program's supposed to flow. And then display the result words that contain the string large. So when it go through, your iteration is going to be large pizza, large spaghetti, large steak. And it's going to tell you which index that it found it under, 0, 4, and 5. And then with the inverted index, as it does it looks through each of the character to represent what large is, it's going to give you, again, the same thing. And so this is a way that we can identify a specific value in the container in the case that where you would have lots of values that could contain that seek item, right? So in this case, we were able to find 3, and it tells you specifically the position of the found item. And we want to double check using the inverted index. Okay. So where you would see that here, okay, it tells you found at the index, which is your position. And then the inverted index, we got that from foods with the index value, and we looked through the result using this. Okay. Any question? All right, so let me take this down so I can put it all together if you want to type all of that in, but just know how to read the program is essential. Okay. So for number 15, given the below Python code snippet, write a statement that converts data type to float 32. So we're using NumPy, and we have an array called myArray, and we use NumPy to build our array. So here are the values. And then we would then add the next line. So you simply bring down your array name, and you can do it 2 ways. You can have it using AS type, and you would pass float 32. Or you can do it another way where you can redefine my array as an array, and then you would pass the value like this, along with using dtype. But dtype has to be the second parameter. Okay. So it is two ways to do this. The easiest, shortest way is to use as type. Another way is to redefine that array. The list that you started out with is going to be the part one of the parameter. And then the second part of the parameter is going to be your dtype. And you just need to declare that it is a float 32. So what that does is it's going to cut that section of memory to a specific size for that type. And it's going to store these values. Okay. And so should be using 50.0, 60.0, 70.0, and so on if we're going to convert it to float type. But if you, in the case where you have integer to start with, and you need to convert it into something that is in a different type, where it would size the storage to the associated type, okay? As you know, that Python, even though we don't type everything that we declare, we can convert the type, right? Because it's intuitive where it would, realize that, oh, the interpreter knows the type that you put in based on what you define. However, you can force type it. You can cast type it as well, okay? Very similar to other C-based language. All right. So those are the two ways that you can convert data type for float 32. For number 16, it says, given the below Python snippet, write the statements that slice, sorry, I took out that, the array down into 3 elements using index values and display its content. Okay. So we have import numpy as num, and we have an array called array4. This is from numpy, so we use num.array to build our array, and we would have these values. So you can, for the next line, you can define this as however you want, but I use sArray for slicing. So sArray, and I want to cut it down using the index, right? So we want to size it down to the 3 elements. So I want to go from the first, right, to the third, okay? So instead of doing it individually, where we can use the colon to indicate from the first to the third. So it's going to cut off right before the 4th index. So in Python, where UN is going to be the end of the beginning of that element value. So I want to go for 3 elements. I would go 0 to 3 like this. Okay. So when I print, I want to say print, and I want to say slice to 3 element array, and then I want to pass the sArray, which I slice down to the first 3. Now, if you want to do the last 3, right? So here's my 0. So this is going to be your -1, -2, -3. So you can go from right to left as well, using the negative value, or you can go from left to right. Because the question was not specific, so I just, assuming that this is going to be just the first 3, so we just cut it from the left to right. But if you need to go from right to left, you can use the negative value. Now, you can also do, right, you can also do positive value where I would, so here's 0, 1, 2, 3, right? I can do 3 to blank. And what that will do is going to cut the last 3 values. Okay, so it will be like this. array 4, that's the array name, and then you can go from 3 to blank, and then just close this. Oops. And what that will do is the interpreter is going to automatically know that I am going to go from 0, 1, 2, 3, yeah, from 400 to the end. Okay, so you don't have to use a specific value here. You can if you want to like mark it. So if you don't put a value after the colon, it's going to assume that it's to the end of the array. Okay, so in this case, if we use the first 3, we have to mark where we want to end, which is right before the 4th element. All right, so this is, you know, for the last. And then you can also do from 3 to 4, 5, right? So you can do 3 to 6, and it would also cut at the end of 5. Okay. I have a typo here. Array 4 is 3 to 6. You can do it this way, or S array is, can't type today, is I really can't type today. Okay, so we can go -1, 2, and 3, right? So you can do -3 to -1, like that. Okay. So there are many ways that you can play with index in Python in order to do that. Okay. All right. For 17, fill in the blank. The blank is an object that maintains a reference of specific memory area. And so if it is a reference of a specific memory area, that's going to be your memory view. Okay, memory view. For 18, which of the following option is not a technique to add compiler directives to Python code? So I can use a decorator or context manager, yes. I can use comment at the beginning of the file, yes. I can use Python command line options, yes. So B is not. You don't use the ampersand with the C variable. Okay. So you can use, so when we talked about Python, we looked at how we would be able to implement that. Okay. Now Python have various options in how you can implement for C's and C extension. So Python is one and C Python is another, very closely related, but very similar. Okay. And if you remember how we define the C variable, we would start with C or C type, right? When we define a function. So, and then we tried using our notebook. For 19, given the below Python script, describe how pointer is used in the program. So, and in the C Python chapter, we would use, right, the double percentage symbol to import in Python when we're using IPython. When you're using the Jupyter Notebook or any kind of tool that uses IPython. And then we would use cdef to define our variable, right? And then here is our pointer. Now, I understand that when we did this part, as Jupyter has changed over time, right? Your textbook say one thing, and then Jupyter incorporation with incorporated Python, and they modified things a little different. So I use the textbook reference. So when you run, remember that we ran into a couple issues where we couldn't print, where they did away. So certain things went away, and then certain things they kept for Jupyter and also IPython. So this is why it's a little different when you run these type of program. Okay, so to define the variable, we would use cdef as we would use Python, right? And then here's our pointer. And in C practice, when you have a pointer, you always need to dereference. So you would have a reference of that same variable. And then in that case, you would redefine, or you would assign it a value. So what will happen is it's going to place this value in the location, right, of your storage. And we would point to that location, okay? So when we created the variable, so let's say that this is memory address hex 100. And then basically you would say that point to hex 100 where it stores 100 as integer. Okay. And I know that this is deprecated, right? Printf is not in IPython anymore. So printf, whenever you see this is this is like C out in C++, but printf is for C only, right? So basically you're importing a function to print from the libc stdio. Okay, I don't think you need this anymore because IPython doesn't support it anymore. And then so when we print this, right, the whole point in doing this print is to be able to show the value. So it's going to go to the address location and it's going to find the value. Okay. So here I put down the explanation that var1 pointer is defined as this. And we need to dereference the pointer. And we would have the pointer is used to display the value, which is this part. Okay. So in technicality for C, this is how you write it, right? But when you try to run this, like I said before, in the new IPython with Jupyter Notebook, certain things don't work because Jupyter just doesn't support it anymore. So you kind of have to think about like what tool you want to use to be able to use IPython. And I know that like IPython is supported in other platforms too, but Jupyter is probably the common one that you see a lot in university and a lot of people use. So I would check out their documentation and forum where certain things that they kept and certain things change over time. Okay. All right. For 20, which Python module is used to translate Python functions to optimize machine code at runtime using the industry standard low-level virtual machine, your LLVM compiler library? That will be your number. Okay, so we touch on that, and that uses your LLVM. For 21, what type of decorator and functions implements different input types to be able to select specialization at compile time without jeopardizing the runtime speed of JIT, just in time, right? So to use JIT method, we would use its decorator known as generated JIT. Okay, so you would use the decorator generated JIT, which is ultimately a function decorating another function, right? So that allows you to implement the decorator for functions that would have different input types. okay? So it would be for compile time. So it doesn't jeopardize your runtime speed. So it doesn't lengthen it or modify it in much. So you would use JIT decorator. That might help with performance in a very expanded program. Okay, so now we are going to talk about inspect type. So for 22, given the below code, use inspect type to display the information about the type while the program is compiled. Okay, so when you look at the program, right, we import NumPy, we define our array, which contains ran. We're going to randomize, that's going to be 10 values. And we are going to print it. So to add to it, you are going to use a decorator. So you're going to use @JIT, which is just in time, as we talked about it up here. And with that, we would follow the decorator with the function. So here we would take, right, each of the value as X, whatever the randomized value here, and we would take it multiplied by 2, so we would double it. Okay, and then we will be able to print it as it goes through the loop and print it as an entire array. Then lastly, to really address this, we would add in the double.inspect type. Okay, as your double is your function that you decorated, and you would use the inspect type, which is the function or the method from the library. Okay. So we would add that in here. That simply is going to be able to inspect, to apply the inspect type function to your array. Any question? Okay, for 23, what type of parallel programming allows a unit of work to run separately from the primary application thread, notifies the main thread about completion or failure of the worker thread? And when you look at parallel programming, we talked about asynchronous programming, which is different than your synchronous programming, right? Where your work is divided into subunits. They are separated from your primary thread. And so when the main thread is completed or failed, right? Later on, we talk about the hang up in that, but when it completes, a certain thread complete, it would need to report that back to the main thread. So your asynchronous programming is a way that we can concurrently, right, output result instead of waiting line by line, top down, compared to synchronous. 24. What type of subroutines are used for cooperative multitasking where the process voluntarily control periodically, or when idle, should be comma, it would enable multiple applications to run simultaneously, and this is going to be your coroutines. So the key word here is coroutines is equivalent to your subroutine. We can implement this with multitasking, and it would allow you to control or put things into pods, right? We would implement sleep with that. So that way other things can be running at the same time. Okay, so your coroutines. For 25, in concurrency programming, what feature implements the wait to allow the rest of the program to continue execution without waiting for the beginning execution. Sound a little confusing, right? So ultimately, it's asking you what feature should you use to implement pause, right? So that way your program can continue execution without waiting. So we would use a callback. Callbacks allow you to do that in concurrent programming. 26, in a concurrent program, what is used to pull status of the event while allowing other tasks to be executed? You would use event loop. You often see this with OS or maybe programs that require a lot of IOs. Okay. So it needs to be able to track, right, the status of each certain subtask. And so an event loop is ultimately a while loop with a callback. Okay. So 26 is event loop. 27, what type of library is used to implement concurrency in Python program? You can use many things. Async.io is one of the most important one, right? We can implement methods or functions from Async.io. And so we worked on this a little bit when we worked on the lab and some of the assignments. For 28, in concurrent Python programming using Async.io, what method is used to execute the coroutine? And in order to execute, you would use the run method from Async.io, and it would be like this. For 29, what type of library is used for composing asynchronous and event-based programs using observable collections and pipeable query operators in Python? And you would use RxPy, okay, for reactive. And I think we came back to this when we talked a little bit about the pattern using observables. But for RxPy, you don't want to mix that up with other library. You can implement observable for Python. For 30, how can you create observable using Rx? You are gonna use observable from iterable method, and that's how you're gonna be able to create observable. One, fill in the blank. The blank is a mode of operation where the task is executed simultaneously in multiple processors in the same computer or reduced overall processing. So this is going to be your parallel processing where you're able to execute multiple tasks at the same time, right, using your multi-core. So we want to be able to maximize the capability of our processor using parallel processing. Now, to write these programs, right, simply you can implement process pool and then be able to use the process, right? And you can also slice time and do other things to make it more feasible. It depends on what you're trying to achieve in your program. Okay. For 32, true or false? In Python, the async.io module is used to run independent parallel processes by using subprocess instead of threads, and that's false. You would use multi-processing module, okay? And we spent a little bit of time on this to be able to adapt the module and write your process pool. You would see more example using multi-thread for Python a lot of the times because each process require individual storage space where it's distributed compared to shared storage, right? Many developers, they prefer to use multi-thread as you know, but the risk for multi-thread, we talk about that on how it doesn't release that memory space, and sometimes it could create error or exceptions in your program. So you got to be careful with threads. So for multi-processor, it's just you're using more space to reduce your time. So you would gain speed by giving it more storage space. So we would see the time versus space concept there. Any question? Okay, next is their long program. 33, given the below program, which method in the program blocks the execution of the main process until the call process is terminated? So this program uses multiprocessing module. We also use OS module, right? We have a couple functions. We have info. We have F. We simply print out module name, right? And the process, the parent and the child process. Okay, you saw this in your lab. Okay, and then for the next function, we would have the function F, and we want to be able to provide details about the function, and then we want to print hello name, and then for the main, we would create our object, and we would start and join as these are multi-processes. Okay, so the question asks you which method of the program blocks the execution until the main process is called, right? Or is terminated. That will be your join, which is the last line here, right? Now, if you have a start with that, the join, the risk in that is that it might utilize, right? It might not block the execution, so you might have it out of order. And we tested this when, if you comment out the join, or, you'll be able to track your process on how it would, handle the subtask when it started. So when you do the join, it's going to block it. Okay? And if you want to really manage and coordinate it accordingly, right? Near the end, we talk about how we would we would create the lock object, right? And be able to manage our resources. Okay, 34. Given the below program, describe the program procedures and explain how the wait is implemented in the program. Okay, again, it is another multiprocessing program. You have a function called show name, right? We would print out the first name, wait for 2 seconds, print out the last name. In the main function, we create an object called P, and this is going to be our process. The target is going to be our function. We're going to start the process, then join it. And then for the last part, we are going to call, right, main. So we want to state that the show name function prints first name at the start of main. It's going to wait 2 seconds. And we would use sleep 2 for that. Then print last name at the end of the main process, which is when the child process is finished. Okay. So it's going to print the last name, and then it's going to come back and it's going to show that your main is finished. When we remove the join, right, this is going to come first. Okay. Any question? Okay, for 35, using the executor interface in a concurrent program, what is used to extract the result from future instances? So we would use concurrent features.wait and concurrent features as completed functions. These are the two functions that you would use. Okay. Then in order to access the result, you would use features result. So ultimately, this is the answer. Okay. But in order to implement concurrent features, you would need to implement these two. Okay. And output the result is going to be using the result method. For 36, in parallel programming, what method is used to prevent multiple processes from executing the protected section of the code at the same time? We came back to this, right? We kind of talked about it, and then near the end, when you looked at how to really handle and coordinate your resources, we talked about having a lock object, right? So you can use lock method. And then we talked about how a lock doesn't really lock anything unless you have the appropriate elements in place. But the lock method, the way it's designed is to prevent more than one processes using that section of your code at the same time. Okay. 37. In Amdahl's law, what is used to measure the benefit of executing a computation or executing a computation in parallel? That will be speed up. Okay. Amdahl's law is about how we would measure speed up for our parallel programs. And when you tested this, when we looked at this in the lab, sometimes you would get pretty close result. Sometimes it doesn't show much improvement, right? So, and we talked about how it would also plateau because, you know, people always think that if you throw in more processors, if you throw in more resources, it will be able to produce more. But, you know, at some point, you're going to get like the same result no matter what. 38. What does the program's efficiency or speed up divided by the number of parallel processors calculation provide? When you're looking at the program efficiency, you're really looking at how well the parallel processing resources are being utilized. Okay. And so when we think about how our multiprocessors is at work handling the task, right? There could be multiple subtasks. Let's say that we would be able to handle many functions using 5 core, 10 core, 12 core, 16 core, etc. You're really looking at how your resources being utilized to execute your program efficiency. Okay. And program efficiency is really the speed up divided by the number of processors. All right, 39. If the computer program is 80% parallelized, as we know that no program is 100% parallelized, right? You know that there gotta be some part of your program or a small part of it is gonna be synchronous or non-concurrent or non-parallel, right? So 80% parallelized using 6-core processor. Use Amdahl's law to determine the estimate speed up. Okay. So we're given 80% parallelized from 100%. So we know that 20% of it is a sequential portion. Okay. So that's what we start with. And then we can plug it into the equation. So we would take 1 divided by your sequential portion, which is 0.2. And then your parallelized portion, which is 0.8 up here. And then divided by your number of core, which is 6. Okay, so sequential plus parallel divided by core. And then would take a fraction of that, so 1 over. So 1 divided by that. So we're going to round it off to roughly 3. Okay, that will be the speed up. Now, the second part here is I try to show that if you have 10%, right, 10% sequential, 90% parallelized, on a 4-core, you're going to get roughly about 3 speed up as well. So if we're looking at an 80% compared to a 90%, 6-core compared to 4-core, we don't see a huge difference in that, right? To the user, to even to systems, you probably don't see a huge jump in that, okay? But if you add in 16-core, right, that might make a difference, okay? So we have to really think about like the number of your processor, and at one point it's going to, you know, even out anyways, right? And then the percentage of your parallelized. So this is the answer, right? I just did this for comparison so you can see. Now, if we don't round it off, we do see a fractional difference. Okay, not a huge difference. 40, true or false? The program is 95% parallels. It can have up to 2,048 cores to achieve up to approximately speed up of 20. More cores will make the program faster, up to 100,000 core. False. Now, it would plateau after a certain number of cores, so the program is actually the same or slower, right? When you put in 100,000 core, it might be slower because then we have to coordinate how the cores are handling the task and to implement that for and controlling, coordinating the lock in that, right? So false for 40. 41, true or false? Increasing the number of processor with a fixed problem size per processor leverages weak scaling to accomplish more work in the same amount of time. True. Most cases. Okay. So you can increase the number of processors and we would be dedicated a certain amount of work in per processor. So we would be able to accomplish more work in the same amount of time. It's kind of like 5 people, right, all join together and do the same task compared to 1 person doing that task. So yeah, in general, that's true. We can't say 100%, but you know. 42. What is the trade-off in achieving the best possible speed up in parallelization? So if you increase the number of processor versus increase how long parallelism. So increase processor versus time. Okay, for parallelism. I think we touched on this in the Untitled chapter. 43, fill in the blank. The blank is a technique that allows the CPU to switch between different software running on different thread. And we talked about time slicing. So we would be able to slice the time, and while that's pausing, the other threads can handle it, right? So you don't have to wait for each thread to be finished. We can pause the main thread and then be able to have, other threads completing the task. So when you output it, you do see that the threads are not all in order, right? Because we're not handling it sequentially. When you slice, you simply put things on pause, and during that slice time, you can put in other threads to be able to accomplish the task. So you can reduce the overall runtime. 44, using threading module, which function returns a list of all currently active thread objects in the program? And I think we touched on this in our assignment. We talked about how we can use enumerate under threading module to be able to return the list of active thread objects. 45, using threading module, which method returns the name of the calling thread, and you would use get name. That's going to show you the name of your calling thread. So if we're monitoring our thread, we can use some of these methods that's implemented for threading module to be able to display. True, false. The primary goal of thread synchronization is to avoid any potential data discrepancy when multiple threads access their shared resources. That's true. So when you synchronize your thread, what you want to do is you want to avoid, right, potential data access that is going to give you inaccuracy, because sometimes some thread would access that region of the memory before the data is updated, so you're not getting accurate data. Okay, so we want to make sure that the data is appropriate when you are using threads, and we would achieve that with synchronization. "47. What type of data container represents an abstract data structure that is a collection of different elements maintaining in specific order?" And we talked about a queue. This is a container that you can use for your workers. Okay. So instead of just using a list, which is a sequential container, right, first to last, where we can use a queue to be able to access both ends. Okay. So that way you can access the container quicker. 48. Fill in the blank. The blank is a data extraction method that automatically makes a request to web pages and downloads specific information. We spent a week on web scraping, right, to really look at HTTP requests and response, how we can automate the pool of data. And so web scraping is the concept. 49, using HTTP requests. What method makes an HTTP or make a request for a specific data from the server to retrieve data and has no other effect on the server and its database? So HTTP, right, we talked about get, and get allows you to obtain what would be your HTML file from the server. So once the server acknowledged the connection, right, it would be able to provide the data, which is in HTML. And so that way the client will be able to retrieve that data. And it would not make any changes because we're not posting or we're not deleting, right? That's the other method. Get just simply retrieve the data from the server. 50. Which HTTP status code is received when the client has sent a bad request? And that's the 400, right? That will be the error. 51. What type of Kaufman deadlock conditions consists of at least one resource in a non-shareable state and held by an individual process or thread that cannot be accessed by others? So if the resource is held by one process or thread and it's not going to release it, okay, then that will be a mutual exclusion. This is the non-shareable state. So once it's held, no other thread or process can access it. That's considered a mutual exclusion. Just think of it as being excluded, right, from the rest. Okay, mutual exclusion. 52, true or false? Deadlock is a situation where a request for an exclusive lock is denied repeatedly, as many overlapping share locks keep on interfering with each other. And that's false, not a deadlock, a live lock. So a live lock is when that lock is being denied, right? Because there are many locks interfering. Okay, so a live lock compared to a deadlock. Okay, so when you have repeated requests, that's a live lock. So make sure we know that. True or false? Starvation can be resolved using algorithm scheduling technique, using queues to store and update increased thread in waiting and shared resources. So a queue allows you to be flexible in how you would add more thread, right? We can append the thread to our container, which is a queue, compared to the limited list or array, right? It won't be that flexible. Array has to have a fixed size. A list, you can have an empty list, but ultimately a queue, it can shrink and grow where it doesn't take up a lot of storage if it doesn't have that much as content. And you would use that to really schedule or coordinate your threads that is waiting, okay, to access the shared resources. So that is true. Starvation, we want to resolve that by using queue and scheduling techniques. 54. In concurrent programming, what type of problem occurs during which output is determinate and dependent on the scheduling algorithm and the order of the tasks to be executed? And that is your race conditions, okay? We talked about different things that can occur, and race condition is where we would have to depend on the scheduling algorithm and the order of tasks needs to be executed. Because sometimes think of it like a race. Something can arrive first compared to the other. So in a race conditions, there's an issue in your scheduling of how the task is completed. 55. The blank are usable programming solutions to be applied on various contexts and have proved to produce expected results. And that's your design patterns. This is the last part that we cover in this class. The whole point in having design pattern is that you can implement it for various areas of your program. It could be for your UI. It could also be for tasks that you want to accomplish with your program, like connecting to your servers, and so on. So it is a way that we would have reusable program solutions. And this is really built on object-oriented programming with a modular approach. So to really achieve this in your project, as some of you asked me, I would really consider looking at the type of design pattern that I want to use for my project. And it would be easier to really start with adapting the classes into your program instead of writing it in later. Because what will happen is in an object-oriented program design, you have to really see how your objects are being shared across the parent class and the subclass and be able to communicate, right, and access the members in those classes. So we want to make sure that we can carry that through in the entire program, because if you just write a synchronous program, right, that, you know, that doesn't implement pattern, and you try to add in the pattern later, you would find that you probably have to restructure your program mostly. Okay. So I would think about like what kind of patterns I want to use, so I can add in those classes, or I can write a separate module in order to adapt that in. And then I also want to think about like whether I'm using thread or processes to really handle, right? And then the important part for this class also is to think about your data structure. What kind of container are you using? How are you storing your data before it actually output, right? Because I see a lot of students that turn in projects a lot of the times, right? They just put things into temporary storage. And then in the case where if the program is extensively ran, what will happen is sometimes data gets lost, right? So you have to think about like where your container would be, how it would be accessing that, especially if you're writing a thread, because it's a shared space, right? Are you protecting the resources? All right, so that way you can produce the right output instead of having race conditions or other issues. Okay, so look at design pattern. 56. What type of pattern consists of objects that handle types of actions within the program, which encapsulate processes, interpreting a language, fulfilling a request, moving through a sequence, and implementing algorithm? And this is a behavior type pattern. So this is a category, right? Not an actual type. The category of the pattern is behavior. And you often see this in AI, in speech text recognition, in you know, a lot of the things that we use nowadays, which is your web requests. And then also for sequence search, where it actually moves through a sequence, or even mapping, okay, like routes. And then implementing, you know, more of an advanced algorithm, that's your behavior pattern. So if you're familiar with like networking devices, for some of you who are interested in security, right? We do see some of this in more of the intuitive things like firewall appliance, you know, more advanced industrial routing. And then, you know, if you're looking at some of like intrusion detection systems, it really utilizes this to really be able to communicate and also to check for certain outstanding or rules and things like that. So a lot of the security tools and systems are embedded Linux. And so a lot of the times they would use Python, and to really write a fully object-oriented, you know, program that is consistent and also efficient, they would implement like behavior pattern. 57. What type of creational pattern includes a group of factory methods where each method is responsible for generating different kind of object. And this is going to be your abstract factory. So abstract factory would include a group of factory methods, okay, to generate different objects. 58. In a builder pattern, what component controls the building process using builder instance? And that's your director. Okay. So the director control or coordinate the process in the builder pattern. And in other pattern, this equivalent role is going to be the manager. So this is going to be director for the builder. 59. What type of pattern is used to copy the object structure to produce a new object? So you would use the pattern to create a copy of the object. And it would create a deep copy of the object. And exactly as its name, prototype. So prototype pattern is just to produce another exact copy. Okay. 60. What type of pattern wraps the original class and provides additional functionality, keeping the class method signature intact? And that's your decorator pattern. Okay. We didn't cover all the patterns because if we did, it will be another course, right? We hit on some of the main popular or common patterns that you see in Python. We did work on a few of them in the lab, so you can see the difference on how to implement pattern. Like we touch on MVC, we touch on other type, but it's really your choice on how you want to use the pattern. Okay, and it is like 20 points in your program portion. So, and I do look for the components when I look at the project. Now, if you leave it out and you decided not to use it, it will just be like the 20 points. And if you met everything else on the project, and if you have extra credit, then I'll supplement it at the end. So I grade the project at its entirety, and then I would go back again after I take a look at your overall grade for all your categories. And then if your project score is lower than the others, then I would take, if you have extra credit, I will put that in. If your project score is great, like some of the last year student, their projects were pretty good, then I can supplement it into things like, you know, a few questions on the final that they didn't do well, or if they have a missed assignment or lab, that would allow. Okay. All right. So I did finish your grading. What I'm going to do is, I know that we did finish the assignment unit 13 and lab 13 right before Thanksgiving week. Okay. So what I'll do for these, I think there are a few people that didn't get to submit it, maybe. I will modify this and I will reopen it. Okay, because I close it on the 27th. So I would give a few days extension just for the last two. So if you didn't get a chance to submit it, I think most of you did. You can work on it. And if you have the final review, you can turn it in today, or you can turn it in by the 4th, which is Sunday. Okay. I did have a video posted from last year. I will try to upload the video again for today, and then relink it. Okay. So that way you have access to it. Now, don't forget that you need to turn in your project by your final exam week. Okay. Both of the parts. So that's due on the 14th. Okay. The second part is just the self-evaluation, which is the Google form after you finish the screen capture that you submitted it. And I do go in and I read individual evaluation. And then if you have the GitHub link, make sure that you give that to me. You can upload, you know, a page that has a screenshot and the GitHub link, or you can add the GitHub link in the comment, whatever you like to do there. Okay, because I think I have it submitted as, let me double check. a website or a file upload. Some students tell me that they couldn't, after they put in the URL, they couldn't upload the file. So if you want to put in a document that has both, that's fine. That way you don't have to do both. But please test your GitHub link. Okay, I get a lot of dead link, and because students don't, put it on public, or so to test it, just open another browser. Like if you're using Chrome, open like, Bing or Firefox, and then copy and paste the GitHub link that you have on there. If it doesn't open, if it shows 404, that just means that it's not publicized, or you didn't publish it, or something is wrong. Sometimes when students edit their GitHub, they don't update or submit click the commit button. And so when I go into it, I don't really have access to any content. And I grade the project part last. So, and then I would add the extra credit. And sometimes students don't respond to my email. So if I can't find a GitHub link, I try to reach out to the person, but I really hate to do that because you will hold up the rest of the class grade. So just make sure you test it, okay? And it just takes like a click or two. All right. So I'm going to look for some of these things like the README file. Just make sure that you have some of the basic content in there. Not just your name and your project name. Put some information like, what your program's about, how to run the program that you wrote. Some programs are very specific, like, and then your source code with the README file. Okay, you can upload the Python file, or you can copy and paste the code onto that and save it as a PY. Okay, for the part 1, I already talked about this, but just to be clear, make sure we look through the criteria here, the rubric. Okay, use your documentation guide. I already put the layout for you and how you should put together your page. And then when you submit, you can upload your Python files. Okay, should be more than one. And then, or you can have a zip file. So if you upload it to your GitHub, you can also have like a source code file, and then you can add those files in there. But if you want to zip it and throw in like 5 Python files together, that's fine. I don't expect you to write 5 modules. But at this level, right, this is an advanced Python class. At university level, they're going to expect you to write like at least 3 modules. Okay, so think about modular approach. If you have a very long program that just sequentially ran, if you have one file that's super lengthy, I would take a look at it again and see how you can write a modular approach. So where you can write a module and then import that in. We worked on that on one of the weeks where we would write separate files and then be able to import in the files and be able to run it as an entire program. Okay, so you already have practice with that. Okay, so that's 150 points total. So make sure that we check out the component, like patterns is 20 points, right? I'm going to look for parallel or multi-thread, that's 50 points. And then I wanted to see how you use the learn concept for the asynchronous programming, that's 20 points. Okay, you need to use at least one external library. Okay, we worked on plenty of the libraries. And then the documentation guide is going to be 40 points. And so again, the Word document is here. Use this to be able to fill out your document. Paragraph wise, I'm only going to be expecting like at least a page, single space. That's fine. Okay. But, later on when you take software engineering classes or not, or other classes, you're going to see that they're going to want like at least 10 pages for that. So give me the documentation guide for your program. Okay. All right, any questions? Okay. So I'll put up the video, and I think the one's already there. You can also use it. Let me stop recording. Okay. I am assuming